So, in this series of video lectures, I'm going to be talking about poverty and economic ethics and some other stuff like that. So let's first just talk about poverty. And when we talk about poverty, there is a poverty rate that the U.S. government measures. And how is that measured? Well, there's two main ways of looking at poverty. And the U.S. poverty rate is measured by what is sometimes called an absolute measure of poverty, where we define a certain set of goods or a certain income threshold, and if someone has enough income to afford that set of goods, they're unpoor, and if they don't have enough income to afford that set of goods, then they're poor. And so in the U.S., this was all sort of decided in the early 1960s. And what happened was that in the early 1960s, among poor households, and sort of that was defined a little bit arbitrarily. So among poor households in the 1960s, they spent about 1/3 of their income on food. So it was decided that we would keep track of the poverty rate by sort of going, how much income do we think you need to buy a sort of cheap but nutritionally adequate diet? And then let's multiply by 3, and we'll call that the poverty threshold. And there are some adjustments for for the number of people in the household, because we know that, say, for instance, children eat less than grown-ups, and we know that people who live under one roof can live more cheaply than if they lived apart. And so roughly, though, you want to think that, say, for instance, for one person, one adult, this will change as the CPI, as inflation happens and that kind of stuff. But in today's prices, the poverty threshold for one adult is about $10,000. And the poverty threshold for 2 adults, 2 kids, is about $20,000. Okay, and so, if your income is less than that, then you're poor, and if your income's greater than that, then you're, obviously not super well off, but not poor according to the government's definition of it. So that's one way of looking at poverty. The UN actually uses a similar method of poverty calculation, but since they're looking at poverty in a sort of global perspective, they have a much, much, much lower number here. And conventionally, with inflation and everything, roughly the UN's threshold is something like $1.50 a day. This changes with inflation, et cetera, out there. $1.50 a day per person. So if you think about 365 days in a year, you're roughly talking about $500 per year per head is the UN's definition of poverty. So that's obviously a much, much, much lower standard of living than you would be considered poor in the United States. But there's a whole different way, and the basic idea here is, can you barely afford enough to eat, and other super basic considerations. There's a whole other different way of looking at poverty, and that's what's called relative poverty. And absolute poverty is fundamentally about what material goods can you consume. And we think about some adequate bundle of material goods, and if you can afford it, you're not poor. Relative poverty instead looks at things in terms of how are you doing compared to what is normal in your society. And so a typical way that this might be calculated, and this is the way a lot of countries, say for instance in Europe, do it, is if your income is less than half the median income. So the median income is the person who's smack dab in the middle of the income distribution. Then you're poor. So, in a country where the median income was $40,000 a year, then if you make less than $20,000, then you're poor. In a country where the median income was $10,000 a year, you have to fall below $5,000 to be poor. And, if a poor country grows, and the median income goes up, then what's considered poor in that country also rises. And they're basically getting at fundamentally different concepts here. This is getting at material well-being. So absolute poverty measures are getting at the idea of material well-being. This is more getting at ideas of social standing. And they're both potentially important things. Which one I think we care about really says something about whether we think fundamentally the purpose of social insurance is to make sure that physically bad things don't happen to people. And if you think that the purpose of social insurance is to make sure that physically bad things don't happen to people, then you're going to favor an absolute poverty measure. And, you might go, maybe this is too low, but, maybe you would say, have enough to eat, can afford a roof over your head, and some kind of adequate health care. Maybe that's your measure of absolute poverty. On the other hand, if you're more sort of worried about issues of social cohesion and what are people's subjective emotional feelings, then you're going to go ahead and be more interested in a conception of relative poverty. And essentially, people are just going to have different philosophical points of view on that.